All right, well, a very warm welcome to this consultation workshop, which is run in partnership by English Australia and the Refugee Student Settlement Pathway Pilot. Thank you very much for coming along. I'd just like to let you know before we get started that we are recording this session. Once we get to the discussion in the breakout rooms, we won't be recording from that point on. So my name's Sophie O'Keefe and I'm the Head of Professional Development at English Australia, and I'll be representing English Australia today. And then we also have Sally Baker with us, who's going to lead you through the majority of the workshop. So just to introduce Sally, she's the Associate Professor of Migration and Education at the Centre for Social Policy and Research at ANU. She's also a member of the Refugee Education Special Interest Group, and she's one of the people who's leading the process to develop the Refugee Student Settlement Pilot. So thanks so much, Sally.
Thanks very much. And thanks to Sophie and English Australia for very generously co-facilitating. It's been really excellent to see this be reached so widely, and there's some familiar names in the group there. So it's nice to see some of you and nice to meet anyone who haven't met before. I'd like to start by just acknowledging, as always, that we're meeting today on unceded lands. I'd like to acknowledge Aboriginal nations as the first peoples of Australia. And thank them for the custodianship of these lands on which we all meet, which have always been places of learning and places of exchange, and also, sadly, places of violence. And to that end, I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and will be Aboriginal land. And I'm meeting today from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples here in Canberra, and I would invite you to acknowledge the lands that you're meeting from today in the chat. So we've got a kind of loose agenda today. A couple of things. One is to say hi and welcome, and to just be really clear from the get-go that this is the start of a conversation. So there's no intention in our discussion today for us to land as a collective of people who work in broadly in the space of academic preparation and English language teaching, or ELICOS. It's really the start of conversation and some thematic work to think about what this idea of a refugee student settlement pathway will look like in Australia. And I'm going to talk to the programme if you haven't heard me talk about it before. And it's really important that this is a dialogue. So there is lots of opportunity for you to ask questions, but also it's really important that we are learning from your experiences as well, being the key colleagues across the country who work at the kind of student-facing end of things when it comes to cross-border students. So not just international, these won't be an international cohort, as I'll speak to as we go on. But also, this is a really excellent opportunity to get an update from Sophie in English Australia with regard to how recent changes might impact on not just this pathway, but more broadly on the ELICOS sector and the kind of work that we do. So please do feel free to pop a question in the chat. Please do feel free to put your hand up and ask a question whenever one comes. If it's a really pressing, burning question and you want to ask it at that moment, that's fine to interrupt me. I'm sure Sophie won't mind also being interrupted if you've got a burning question. We've scheduled this for 2 hours. We might not need the full 2 hours, but we've tried to keep the presentation quite light so that we can spend a lot more time discussing. So this really is designed to be a consultative session rather than a lecture. Does anyone have any questions at this point that will inform how you engage? Excellent. In which case I will hand over to Sophie to give us an update, please.
Okay, thanks so much, Sally. First of all, I just want to say that English Australia fully supports the Refugee Student Settlement Pathway. It aligns to our ethical stance of supporting positive study and settlement outcomes for refugees. We're also really excited about the work being done in Australia, especially given the positive outcomes with similar pathway in Canada. We really welcome the inclusion of English language support as a consideration in the pathway design. So thank you so much for reaching out about this consultation workshop, Sally. And we recognise that this English language support offered before students begin their degrees and during their degrees will contribute significantly to students' success in their courses, but also to their well-being and their sense of belonging in Australia. So Sally has asked me to begin by just giving some updates that affect the ELICOS sector in terms of the policy and legislative landscape at the moment. And there certainly have been a lot of changes in the migration space over the past months. So I'm just going to cover three of the major changes that are impacting our sector at the moment. So firstly, there have been changes to processing patterns of student visas. And in particular, we're seeing large-scale delays in visa processing and also a lot of visa refusals to students who normally in the past would have had their visas accepted. So the data from Department of Home Affairs is showing that these delays are quite severe across all international ed sectors. And this is visible when we compare the number of applications lodged versus the number of applications granted. And many English Australia members have shared with us that they're seeing major delays in processing of both offshore and onshore applications. And some of our members have noted, for example, that they haven't seen any visas granted for onshore applications in several months. So there certainly has been a change in the granting of visas. For many students who are affected by the delays, they've now missed intake dates for their pathway programs, and this can really mean a delay of up to 6 months or even a year in their study plans. For onshore students, many of them are now nervous about starting study programs while they're still on bridging visas, waiting for their student visas, because they're not sure if they'll eventually get their student visas. They're obviously investing in a course, but they're not sure if they'll be able to finish their course. So this is very concerning for those students. So as well as the delays, at the same time, visa refusal rates have spiked for a number of our key market countries in ELICOS. So for example, Colombia, which is the #1 nationality for ELICOS at the moment, has had a visa grant rate of between 85 to 95% previously. But in the month of January, we saw that this crashed to only 25%. So a reduction of 95 to 25 for Colombia. There have been no major political or other changes in Colombia, so we can only guess that a decision has been made in immigration to block these applications for some reason. So the concern from ELICOS is that this is going to damage the long-term reputation of our sector. Obviously, applicants who apply for a visa, pay $700 and then get knocked back also get a black mark against their name for any future visa applications around the world. So this is concerning for them. English Australia is working really hard to advocate for a more fair and transparent visa processing application of visa processing at the moment. And we're really calling for consistency and transparency, which we're not really seeing. So that's the changes in terms of processing patterns for student visas. There have also been changes to the English language requirements for student visas, and these came into force last Saturday on the 23rd of March. And these were changes that were planned to initially come into force in the middle of this year. But they were announced suddenly at the end of last week and have already come into force. To summarise the changes, the required levels of English language proficiency for a student visa will increase from 5.5 IELTS or equivalent to 6.0 IELTS or equivalent. So lots of aspects of the change, such as course exemptions, are yet to be finalised, but there's been a suggestion from government that they'll release these in the next few weeks. It's important to note with these changes that ELICOS only enrolments where students are just studying ELICOS, they're exempt from these minimum level changes, and applicants on ELICOS only visas don't require any minimum level of English to get their visa. Foundation programs are also exempt from the increase. So those foundation applicants still only need to demonstrate 5.5 for standard foundation courses. One important area that's causing a lot of confusion in this space is that a student who enrolls in ELICOS and then a vet or higher ed course on a single visa, so a packaged visa, a pathway student, can do only a maximum of 20 weeks of ELICOS. So in essence, they must have a minimum level of 5.0 IELTS or equivalent when they arrive, with the expectation that they'll improve by 0.5 of a band IELTS every 10 weeks of ELICOS study. So a full band in 20 weeks. So this 20-week limit has existed for years now, but immigration hasn't been enforcing it. And indeed, you know, many ELICOS colleges have pathway programs that run for 30 weeks. But it seems that immigration has made a change and that this 20-week limit is going to be strictly enforced now. And finally, the other major change which has happened in the migration space is the government's intention to increase the use of the no further stay condition for certain students. So this announcement was made by Minister O'Neill from Department of Home Affairs via a media release on the 21st of March. It's caused quite a bit of concern and confusion among our members. Basically, immigration has stated that they believe that applications for student visas should be made offshore. And so they want to prevent people who come to Australia, for example, on a tourist visa and then apply for a student visa onshore from doing this. So what they've said is that they intend to increase their application of the no further stay rule on visitor visas, which means that those who are on tourist visas, for example, and then discover a course that they would like to study, won't be able to apply for a visa onshore to be able to do that. So English Australia is working hard in the advocacy space to get more detail on this change and in particular the reasoning behind it. So we are in discussion with the government about this proposed change as well. So Sally, I will stop there, but I think they're all issues which are affecting our sector and do bear some light on this process that we're going through today.
Thanks, Sophie. There's a lot of changes, and I think the migration context is really significant, and but there are some significant points of difference from what you've talked about with the pathway. But I wonder if before I start to talk about the pathway, does anyone have any questions for Sophie about any of the updates? In which case, if you do, please pop them in the chat, or if I say something that seems pertinent and you want to ask a question to Sophie again, please do just raise your hand or pop it in the chat so that we can address it.
Yeah, and I'll pop a link, Sally, into the chat, which has all of this information in a newsletter format that people can read over and review once we finish.
Thanks, Sophie. It certainly feels like it is a time of great advocacy to bring migration and education into dialogue more closely. And certainly from the Refugee Education Special Interest Group perspective, the work we've been doing over the last 8 years has mostly focused on people seeking asylum and the kinds of barriers that temporary protection have given. And so which of course crosses over into some of the issues with the international students face. But I'm going to talk to you about a slightly more positive story, although it is set against a really quite negative and particularly divisive and negative context today. I'm sure that if you've been following the news, you'll see that there's a lot more challenges in the narrative about refugees that the High Court decision around indefinite detention have created. And of course, that does fuel the conservative right-wing machine that is anti-immigration. But I think it's really important to also acknowledge that the Minister for Immigration, Andrew Giles, has been extremely positive and has worked extremely hard to do a couple of things. And so before I talk about this particular pathway, I just want to acknowledge that in the last year, the Minister for Immigration has managed to get rid of temporary protection. So we're seeing people moving from safe haven enterprise visas and temporary protection visas into permanent protection via resolution of status processes. Some of those still have kinks. So we've heard that people on ROS visas are struggling to get access to HECS, which they should have access to. So that's a continued point of advocacy for the ReSig. But also the minister was successful in increasing the humanitarian program. So that's the government's kind of funded program for refugees arriving in Australia or for onshore transferal to 20,000 last year. So that was a pretty significant increase. And the government have put an ambition to the public, and this was an election kind of campaign promise, to increase that program to 27,000 by 2027. And then last year, the Minister for Immigration also announced that the government had committed to the ALP platform promise to create an additional 10,000 complementary pathway places. So they're pathway places that sit outside of the 20 to 27,000 refugee humanitarian places per year. And that's really significant because that means a sum total of 37,000 refugee places. And that's an increase from what was dropped during COVID to 13,750. So a pretty profound increase. And that's not necessarily been an easy task against this negative and divisive discourse around migration. And so within the complementary pathway places, the 10,000, there are two existing programs that you may be aware of. One is called it's called the Community Refugee Integration Settlement Pilot, that's run by our colleagues, Community Refugee Sponsorship Australia. So that's a local community program where a group of at least 5 people come together and do some fundraising and invite and support a refugee family to resettle in their local area. So it's very place-based. And so they have an ambition to take 1,500 people over the first 4 years. I want to say that's correct, and I'm sure that if I haven't got that quite right, someone will correct me in the chat. The other pathway that currently exists is a skilled labour mobility pilot. So refugees can arrive in Australia through employer sponsorship via Talent Beyond Boundaries, and also mostly receive permanent skilled visas and can bring their families in. And there are concessions in those visas to make with flexibility with things like English language proficiency requirements for family members. So the Refugee Student Settlement Pathway is intended to be a third pathway in the suite of complementary pathways. And by that means it's a front door route to a durable solution. Sometimes in other countries, it's a route, it's a pathway to a pathway. But in Australia, we're very, there's no real intention to do anything other than look at what the Canadians do with their mature model, something that's been running since 1978. You may be aware of this, run by the World University Service Canada. Their student refugee program takes about 150 students a year with 100 Canadian universities and vocational colleges. So that's an important point because in the future, we would hope that TAFE would also get involved. World University Service Canada operates in now 4 countries. So they work in displacement countries, and those countries are Uganda, Kenya, Jordan, and Lebanon. They do a process of identifying and recruiting potential students, selecting and matching, and then they link them with universities. And then universities provide some wraparound support from the university itself, but also from a local campus group or a local committee who provides settlement support. And it's very much this model that the Minister wanted us to emulate. We're working closely with WUSC. And so the Refugee Student Settlement Pathway that I'm talking about today, or certainly the blueprint for the pathway, because it is still with Cabinet and about to go to an expense committee review, or an expense review committee, that would make more sense, for consideration in this year's budget. And we hope to hear in May with the budget about this being announced. So the model of the Refugee Student Settlement Pathway is to use a humanitarian visa. So this is the point of departure, I think, from the update Sophie just gave us. We're not talking about 500 visa holders. We are or student 500 visa, the student visa. We're talking about probably a 202 visa, which is a permanent protection visa and gives recipients immediate access to the whole set of Commonwealth supports, Centrelink, Medicare, but also importantly for this piece, a Commonwealth supported place and access to HECS. And you may well be aware that actually permanent residents don't get access to HECS. So it's really only people with permanent protection who have this immediate access to HECS. So this would make these this group of students a kind of a domestic Oz Award cohort. So they'd arrived in Australia with international needs, but at the moment of enrolment into their undergraduate program, they would become domestic students and probably would be captured as equity students and would be eligible for supports available to domestic students as well. And what we're proposing, I think it's important to say this from the beginning, is over the first phase of this pathway, we've been talking about numbers of around 50 students. So we're not talking about a large number of students. It's certainly not going to help to hit that 10,000 complementary pathways target in the short, medium, or probably even the longer term, given that Canada's really only taken about 150 after 40 years. But it's obviously an intention to do what the Minister calls as expanding the social licence, and for Australia to be able to demonstrate to the global community in really meaningful ways that it is really playing its part in terms of responding to what is an unfolding and consistently increasing humanitarian nightmare. So I think it's now about 114 million people are displaced around the world, and of the 114, at least around 40 million are now refugees, are classified as refugees. So we're talking about an absolutely massive challenge for the world, and on the basis of that, the global community has come together and said that it needs to do more durable solutions, with complementary pathways being one of these. And last December 23 just gone, there was a second Global Refugee Forum in Geneva, and the Australian government pledged this 10,000 complementary pathways promise, but it also pledged to scope the refugee student settlement pathways. So these are important signals to the global community that Australia really means business when it comes to shifting the dial in terms of how we have recently responded to the humanitarian crisis. So what we have done so far, and it's really important we talk about this in terms of a blueprint, because we are still waiting for an announcement from the federal government. There is an ask of Treasury, which is why we're waiting for this to be announced in the budget. But I would say that it's not a significant ask, and that universities have been very clear to not just the Minister for Immigration, but also the Treasurer and to the Minister for Home Affairs, that universities in Australia that have been involved are very willing to also invest in the costs associated with this. And complementary pathways rest on government being able to share what we've tried to describe as the opportunity, but really is the costs of resettlement, to be able to increase that social licence and bring more refugees into Australia. And importantly, not just bring more people in, it's not just an access issue, but it's making sure that when people come, that they have really good settlement and integration outcomes as well. So a very short history. Last June, the Minister convened a roundtable with universities across the country. 30 of the 39 came. He presented the idea. Everyone said, what a great idea, we'd love to know more, which gave the Minister a kind of license to then go ahead and do some co-design. So we've carefully co-designed this with Department of Home Affairs colleagues. And I have to say, it's been a total dream. It's not the I always thought this would be a fight between, a fight to government and a fight to universities, but actually neither of those things happened. We had a couple of really important senior executive champions within the higher education sector, one of whom is my new boss at the ANU, Professor Bronwyn Parry. And we've convened a consortium of universities to work as a block and to demonstrate our collective intention to make this work and kind of erode some of those competitive tensions that we know exist in the sector. So we've consulted already with a lot of people, including EA, speaking with Sophie last year, and including the IEAA, so recognising, of course, that this does overlap in all sorts of ways with international, and it does have ELICOS implications. Even if there isn't a visa requirement, we do still need to think really carefully about English language proficiency, but maybe there's some flexibility. We've also spoken to DFAT because we can see strong connections with Oz Award. We've spoken to test providers. Since then, we've spoken to Pearson, we've spoken to Cambridge, we've spoken to others. We were obviously working with a lot of the peak bodies, but this was to design the blueprint. So we've designed the blueprint, and now this meeting is part of a series of consultations to do the kind of implementation and operationalisation talk. So this is a sharing model. Government have a part to play. Universities have a part to play, and we hope that that will extend to VET and TAFEs, but also community has a part to play. It won't work without there being university community, whether that's students and staff or whether that's alumni or broader community colleagues coming together. So government will, of course, manage the immigration part, and in the short term, they'll manage the offshore component. They'll obviously cover the initial settlement costs, including Centrelink and Medicare. But important for the government to kind of, balance the budget. It won't include AMEP because these students will come with a level of English that will be beyond functional. And it won't include the humanitarian support program, the HSP. But it will include access to specialist services such as trauma and torture survivors support. So what we call STARTs in New South Wales, or Companion House in Canberra, or Foundation House in Victoria. So those kinds of specialist supports will be available to people who come, to students who come through this pathway. So it's not passing. I know this has been a concern from some colleagues as I've been talking about this pathway. It won't be passing complex trauma-related needs onto university mental health professionals, for example. So there will be a kind of shared responsibility, although the settlement sector will be involved in consulting, but they won't necessarily be doing the work. That will be something that we'll do collectively. Universities have offered to do a couple of things. So one is to share the cost of a coordination body, to provide a staff member or a fractional staff member to link with both the campus groups, the students, the coordinating body, so that there's a cohesive approach. To provide, and this is the bits that are most important, to provide some foundational preparation, academic preparation input and pay for that. So that's both in country before arrival in Australia and on arrival. Accommodation for at least 6 months, free accommodation for students, and money for a stipend and equipment, for example. And then university supporter groups come together. So this might be a composition of students and staff. As I said, it might include alumni or other people associated with a university to provide HSP, so humanitarian support program like support, arriving, picking someone up from the airport, helping someone to navigate to the local area, taking them to their first accommodation, providing basic hygiene packs, basic furniture packs, and doing some important fundraising. Although how much that fundraising what a kind of upper threshold might look like is yet to be decided. So a lot of these things are aspirations, and this is the process we're starting to pin things down. So we are talking about a young cohort, 18 to 25, single no dependents and undergraduate only. This is because this maps to the World University Service Canada program. But I think there is some latitude to test slightly more complex cases once the program has had a first wave of students. So there is talk about maybe thinking about how we'd manage complexity in a second wave while we're doing a longitudinal evaluation. It's a 4-year initial phase. We're not calling it a pilot, we're calling it the pathway, but we're thinking that the first 4 years will be a kind of pilot testing phase. So we'll see 2 waves of students, first wave arriving late 25 to start undergrad study in 26, second the following year, and then we'll have 2 cohorts to be able to look at with the evaluation. But we don't intend it to finish, obviously, with a 2026 intake. We want this to become habitual. And because these students are domestic students, because they get CSP and HEX, they will assume the student contribution from the moment they start their study. That's a pretty important distinction from the Canadian program. But instead, we're going to provide a soft landing, which includes the academic support in advance, the academic support on arrival, with time to do things like foundation, bridging programs, ELICOS, depending on what the student needs and what's a feasible requirement or a feasible ask of universities or other providers, and also to make an introductory academic program for Oz Award students available for this cohort. All of this will need some tweaking. We're not just saying we'll take this cohort and pop them in an IAP class. But what we have said to universities is there are costs. So the cost will be upwards of from 25,000 for 2025, and those figures haven't had inflation adjustments added, to around 37,000 for the second year, because the government wants to test taking the first year of Centrelink off the table. So, you know, a kind of rounded figure would be about $40,000 per student as an investment, but that includes academic preparation before they come, their flights, their medicals, their exit visas, the kind of settlement support piece, the academic support piece, including additional tutoring as Oz Award students, or availability of additional tutoring as Oz Award students get. And then after that first year, they should be transitioned with the support of their campus group into their own accommodation. They are able to work on a humanitarian visa and to be, you know, well connected to local community and diaspora communities by the end of the first year. And at that point, we would hope that they would then themselves join the local campus group so that they can provide their own experience to help the next wave of students. I might just pause a second and see if anyone's got any questions. Maya asks in the chat, excellent question, Maya, who's going to do the offshore recruitment? So we do need to create a coordination body, so a kind of WUSC Australia to do to work with who is likely to be WUSC. We can't say it's definitely going to be WUSC because obviously there are procurement processes, but to shadow existing and well-established operations in probably Kenya and probably Jordan, so that we can build capacity. And the Australian government have expressed interest in the early conversations about building capacity to be able to do that in the Asia Pacific, because no one's operating on a kind of regular, except in Bangladesh. There is some work happening in Bangladesh. So it would be good for us to be able to build our own capacity to do that selection and recruitment. And probably it would align in all sorts of ways with the ways that Oz Award students are interviewed and recruited. But we'd be looking for students who have a protection need as well as academic potential. And in Kenya, it would be in camp context. So it's WUSC work in both Dadaab and Kakuma, but in Jordan, it would be from probably urban, more likely to be urban displacement. Ryan asked in the chat, who's going to be teaching them? Ryan, I might need a bit more information from you there in terms of before they arrive in Australia. And drawing from Kenya and Jordan, probably, can't confirm. I'm just going to move on with my slides and I'll keep an eye on the chat. So we have, as I said, we've created this consortium to help to work together. There's 13 universities in at the moment, but I was speaking to another university earlier this week. This is not a contained list. It's very other universities are very welcome to join the consortium. There's no cost for joining the consortium. It's just the opportunity to contribute to these discussions. Although a lot of these workshops are public access. The students, sorry, going back to Ryan's question. In fact, let me talk about what WUSC do. Let me talk about what the Canadians do, because this might help to answer some of these questions. So a big shout out to my colleague Andre from WUSC, who let me borrow from some of her slides. So in Canada, what happens if let's say that we're working in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. So a candidate would submit an application. Now in Kenya, a baseline for any applicant for this pathway is that they have to have finished something equivalent to secondary education. And a candidate would submit an application. They would hear about it through camp networks. In Jordan, it would happen through local connected communities. The local committee, that's the campus group in Canada, submits a sponsorship plan to WUSC. WUSC and the local partners evaluate the applications. So for every course, WUSC work with, and we would work with each university to determine what kind of offerings you would want to prioritize, what kind of students you would want to bring in. And by that, I mean, you know, are you looking for particular disciplinary or professional orientations, or do you have a particular diaspora community in your local area, your local campus area, who you know will be able to provide that kind of additional support or be involved in a local committee? So once the application has been submitted, there is a process of connecting that with the UNHCR to make sure that they have refugee status, that their protection claim has been upheld. Then WUSC submits candidates' names to Canadian government to make sure that there aren't any barriers with issuing a visa. There are a couple of points of English language testing. So there's a screening test undertaken to determine candidates who are able to be put forward. And once a candidate has been determined to be a refugee and has a likelihood of getting a visa, WUSC then start to offer additional classes. So they offer English or French classes, obviously for the Canadian linguistic landscape. The candidate takes an English exam. It doesn't actually have to be IELTS or TOEFL. It could be Duolingo. So WUSC do use Duolingo, and that's a big question for this group, actually, in terms of what might be the best test instruments. What's a challenge, and Andre could speak to this if she was with us, but time difference wouldn't allow that, is that IELTS, obviously, if it's a test center exam product, testing product like IELTS, it's incredibly difficult to get refugees from a camp context to, for example, Nairobi to sit an exam. It's expensive and it's laborious. And so WUSC's position is that the best possible outcome will be an online product with a provision of trusted local partners in situ to help to maintain testing conditions. The local committee in the university are involved in the choice of candidates. So WUSC might put, for example, 3 candidates forward for a place that they know that, for example, the University of Canberra have got, and then University of Canberra are involved in choosing that committee. What we haven't decided in Australia is how involved the local committee or the university support group will be in that process. We have to remember that this is a model that Canada's model has evolved over 40 years. So it might be more appropriate in the testing phase to leave that more with universities to make decisions. But certainly it's important, and I know that my colleagues at Community Refugee Sponsorship Australia would be cross if I didn't make the point that it's incredibly important for campus groups to be as involved as they can be in this decision, because it helps to build relationship and helps to really drive kind of strong connection, because what we're essentially asking with campus groups is a long-term volunteering contribution, and that requires some thought about, particularly for students who are busy working and have exams and things, how they do that. So there's really, what's important here is that there are 2 points of testing. There's a screening test, and then there's a point of test, another English language test closer to departure, closer to arrival in Canada. And obviously there are all sorts of immigration processes. So while we have put together a bit of a schedule of what we think it will look like, there's all sorts of things that could possibly get in the way. In between the period of someone being offered a place and departing their displacement context, they will be offered kind of standard computer classes and a little bit of cultural orientation. But it is also possible for students to do an academic preparation course, which I'll speak to in a moment. So what does WUSC do? I mean, there's a couple of really important things. They can undertake special consideration. They will put together a student profile as well, so they'll compile information, and they're a trusted partner with the Canadian government, so they are able to do some things like document what's the right word here? They're able to look at, kind of make a decision on certification of documents, or to make some cases where there might be documents missing. So they are able to, and have over a period of time, advocated for a series of concessions for students, certainly in terms of flexibility with documents, authentication was the word that I now can't say, to verify documents. So they've got that kind of trusted relationship to be able to do verification, to be able to request waivers with official translations of documents, because they've been working in these contexts for so long. They've got really trusted relationships. They've petitioned to use an overall GPA if no secondary transcripts are available. There are obviously fee exemptions, because we're talking about a cohort who don't have any resources necessarily that they can draw on, and also are not just sitting around waiting for their next English test, often working, living in survival conditions, and don't necessarily have a lot of time to dedicate to, careful study of the English language. They have advocated, and I think this is particularly significant for today, with flexibility with language tests and for alternative demonstrations of proficiency or qualifications to be accepted. They have petitioned for students with one to be accepted one band lower than standard. Again, that's a big question that I'd love to hear from everyone in the group. And they recognise that there are gender disparities here, so they've also requested additional flexibility for female candidates. The condition of being a single person with no dependents is a challenge, I think, for gender. It's been a topic of great discussion, and we haven't found a way forward with it, but it's certainly something that we're still discussing, and we would welcome thoughts on how that might work. So WUSC does a lot, and we want to replicate some of these in Australia. So we do need to develop our capacity through creating a national coordination hub. So they have an advocacy component and able to advocate on an individual basis for particular students, particularly around those kind of entry requirement flexibilities and language flexibility. If there was, for example, a really outstanding student who maybe needed a little bit more help with their speaking, for example, or a bit more time, then we could negotiate with a university that wanted that candidate for a little bit more time. So the minimum requirement of 4 weeks of ELICOS, which I know is a challenge, is only a minimum requirement, and it doesn't have to be pure ELICOS. It could be ELICOS within a foundation program. It could be within an introductory academic program. Each university is going to be able to respond to that in a way that suits their needs best. Again, remembering that we've really asked universities not to have to build new things. It won't work if it costs too much money for universities. It needs to be kind of working with existing services, and hopefully, you know, naive optimist in me wants to say, oh, it'd be great to bring, you know, all of our brilliant ELICOS knowledge directly into play with post-enrollment services, for example, which from my perspective of working in university doesn't always happen for students who have continuing language development requirements. The WUSC is a coordinating body, so we would want to do the same. They offer training to local campus groups. We think that in Australia, that would be where Community Refugee Sponsorship Australia would be able to play a really important role, because they've done all of this great work in developing training for community sponsor groups. They provide access to academic preparation and work with local learning partners. So there are products already in these kinds of contexts where there are, for example, academic preparation programs. Here's one. There are a list that I could send if anyone's interested. But this, the Refugee Higher Education Access Program has been developed by Bard College in partnership with Arizona State and another university that I've forgotten. It's an American consortium, but the kind of modules have been well considered, and it's regarded as a pretty good program, and has been supported by the Open Society University Network in terms of its development. But there's no reason why we couldn't also think about developing or repurposing products that you might already use, either in the ELICOS or in the foundation sections, or even enabling education, or certainly look to provide something that's got some branding so that there is a connection between student and university before arrival in Australia. That's, I'm going to turn over to you in a moment, but I'll just go through some of the questions, and please do let me know if you've got any questions as well. I'm going to go to Ryan, can you let me know if I've answered your question already? Maya says it will be important to develop in-country partnerships. Absolutely, that's a fundamental part of this. One thing we've asked DFAT to do is to help us to map what educational aid already exists and who's working in an educational capacity in areas in the Asia Pacific, because obviously there's a pipeline issue as well. If you know, only around a quarter of refugee children get access to secondary education, only about 3/4 get access to primary education. So that creates a major kind of block pipeline, not just for education pathways, but also for skilled pathways. Hongsa, hi Hongsa, have you got a contact with IDP or Pearson? I spoke with Pearson at the APAI conference in Perth a couple of weeks ago, and I've convened a panel of language testing experts, and we're going to actually do a sample test from Duolingo, one from Pearson and one from Cambridge. I haven't spoken to IDP yet. But I'm really interested. One of the questions, as you can see here, is which kind of tests do we think would be best for this cohort? Jonathan, do you anticipate there will be pressure from governments to move to regional areas? Well, it's a good question. We do have some regional universities in the consortium. And I think funding constraints, which are very strongly related to the updates that Sophie shared with us before, are making this a much more difficult proposition. I don't think government will push for these students to go to regional areas, but I do think government are pushing for regional resettlement in the broader sense. I don't think it will impact on this though, because we really need the regional universities to be engaged in this in the pathway. And so far, most of the regional universities who are in the consortium have said that they're really interested in being involved in co-design, but they don't know that they'll be able to participate because of cost constraints. But we're working on that. We're hoping that maybe some philanthropic investment might help to shift that. But actually, when it comes to regional areas, we also need to think about arrival infrastructure. And I think it would really depend on there being existing diaspora communities or, welcome refugee city status or other newly arrived refugees. What we haven't determined is how much of a choice refugees will get and where they go. So some of these are good questions. Tetiana says, will these students be joining existing bridging or academic English courses? Well, Tetiana, that is exactly the topic. I think I'm interested to know your thoughts on whether what that might look like. But I don't think, I mean, with 50 students, most universities have said they'll take 2 per wave. So I don't, there's no feasibility kind of proposition there to create new classes just for 2 students. So I think we'd try and make spaces available in other existing classes rather than create new courses. Lily, hello Lily, what is the maximum study for ELICOS? Well, I think that's yet to be determined. So remembering that they don't have an ELICOS requirement on their visa, I think that's really up for the sector to think about what would be a minimum or a maximum in terms of duration or in terms of time spent in ELICOS, direct instruction. The challenges of particular disciplines cannot be overlooked, nursing being one, for example, where there is a high English language requirement or and probably quite inflexible English language requirement before starting the course and then again on completion for registration. So these are really important discussions we'll need to have in terms of which professions or which disciplines or which courses and programs are going to be best for a cohort who may have a developing academic literacies need as opposed to language, or may not be able to meet a high threshold in a language proficiency test for reasons of stress as opposed to proficiency. So we'll need to give those some thought, and I'm really interested to hear about that. They won't have any attendance or academic performance requirements because they're not on a 500 visa. So I don't think you could put that requirement on a domestic student, but please tell me if I'm wrong. Thank you, Hong Sa. I think the government and universities in the first instance are going to be really keen to work with WUS because they're a known entity and because they've got such established processes. But I've been approached by lots of people, particularly organisations that work with Afghan women, about whether there's some flexibility. Obviously, I've got absolutely no power here, but we could certainly advocate once the programme's announced. Thank you, Ryan, for coming back. Thank you. Okay, any other questions?
Sally has put an extra one in the chat.
Thanks, Catherine. No, I don't think the stipulations in the migration review would apply because they'd be coming on humanitarian visas. But this is really the question, Catherine. Should there be some flexibility, or is it setting people up to fail if there's flexibility and there isn't then an additional foundation, a semester's worth of foundation, which isn't budgeted? It's not what we've asked. That's not a minimum requirement. And to that end, and thank you everyone for your great questions. I don't have answers for everything because actually that's part of the process here. What I'd love to do now is to invite you to choose a room. So we're going to set up 4 rooms with 4 different questions. So please choose the question that most aligns with your expertise or that you're most interested in. The first room, I want to think about that academic preparation. So this is perhaps for people who work in foundation. What is the kind of core content that you think students should have in addition to having completed something that looks like secondary education? And I'll just note for the record that in Kenya, the medium of instruction is English, and that WUSC say Kenyans often have better maths than a lot of Canadian domestic students. So, you know, because we were talking about maybe there needs to be a maths prerequisite component. And they said for Kenya, for example, that's generally not the case. And they actually, you know, they're studying in English. So room 1 is about academic preparations. And what should be in a kind of academic prep kind of package. What would be best scenario? Could we use something that exists in Australia? Should we obviously need to work with whoever it is, likely WUSC and local connected partners to help to deliver, but maybe if it's self-paced, not deliver in terms of direct instruction, but to put things together and to distribute. Room 2 will be this question of language proficiency. So what is the appropriate level? Is 1 band lower an appropriate measure for Australia? And what tools do you think should be used to measure language proficiency? Do you have any strong views on, for example, IELTS versus Duolingo versus Versant, the Pearson product? I'm sure you know these better than I, or the CPT from Cambridge are some options there. I think we do need to dismiss or put in the very hard basket test centre products because of the logistical issues. Room 3 is a question about what existing supports are you aware of that might be helpful, particularly language. I really want to be clear. We're going to run another session on the 17th of April about things like peer mentoring and caseworker support to help to support refugee students in higher education. So I'm really thinking about what kind of supports are you aware of. I know if he's still here that James at UNSW has done a lot of work on speaking clinics, and I've got the name wrong, James, sorry. But you know, what kind of things are you aware of that we could know about and that we could share information about and think about developing as, you know, a set of good practice ideas that universities might want to think about taking on. I'll be in room 4, which is the wildcard room. So, you know, we might want to speak about something not included in those other broad rooms. I have noted the questions from Lily and Tatiana. I'm going to have to ask the question and come back to you about challenges with lowering the band. What I will say, though, is that the WUSC program in general has something like a 10% attrition rate, which compares with a 30% attrition rate in Canadian higher education. It's astoundingly high. So, so they have a really good success rate. And a lot of that, I think, is down to the community support, the campus support. You know, it's something that a lot of students would benefit from, to be frank, and that we you know, for capacity reasons isn't offered. But I can ask those questions about common challenges and you know, Canadian experience. The Canadians haven't done a lot of evaluation, so they don't necessarily have immediate kind of impact studies that we can refer to, but they do have some good things that we can forward on to the group afterwards. So I'm going to stop speaking and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. When you choose your room, I would invite you please to nominate someone in the room to be able to speak back on behalf of the conversation that you had, but there will be a note taker in every room who's going to be taking notes for myself, and I will then distribute a post-meeting report to everyone so that we've got a record of the discussion, but it won't be a verbatim record of your conversation. And if there's something that you want to share but you don't want to be noted for the record, please just let the kind of person in your room who is facilitating know. Sophie, I think we can open the rooms.
Yeah, right.
Given how much I've spoken, we could also take a comfort break. So if you need to go, come back sometime just after 4, and we can get the kind of conversation can get started at just after 4 o'clock.
Okay, sounds good. Sorry, Sally, just to confirm, how long will people spend in the rooms?
Well, I guess it's really a tolerance question. How long do you want to stay on until 5, or would you like to kind of finish a bit earlier? I love an early mark, but
yeah, I think finishing a bit earlier would be great.
Why don't we say a 20-minute conversation?
20 minutes? Yeah. Okay,
yeah,
that sounds good. And then we'll come back. Just for James and Kat, you are taking notes in the rooms that I've suggested. All right, I'll open up the rooms in case anyone wants to go in early, and choose your room, and conversations will kick off at 4 p.m.